morning, everybody. Good morning. Okay, I'm not going to do the same thing everybody does. I'm Margette Upshur. I'm the Director of Economic Development and Tourism for the City of Lynchburg. Thank you all for getting up this morning. Frigid temperature. We're all sissies. And braving the cold to come out and learn more about opportunity zones. So the city, when this legislation was out and about, the city immediately identified census tracts that met the qualifications and submitted those to the state, and had 4 areas of the city, and it's by census tracts, so that's really an important piece. That even though you might think that it falls in line, there are things where it just cuts right across the street. So it's really important to look up the address of where these opportunity zones are. And so the governor did the selection on the census tracts for each one of the municipalities. So we wanted to invite, we had one meeting and we just thought it continues to evolve. And as you might imagine, it's complicated. And so we really wanted to reach down and have Virginia Community Capital and Adam Northup to come back. And we really want to answer your question. There is no such thing as a dumb question. So please feel free. If you have a project, if you have an idea, Adam is very polite. So it will be fine, and that's the only way we're going to learn, because I find with anything that we do in our office, enterprise zones, all of that, I can talk about it, but until you actually have a project that you walk through with it, it can be challenging to try to figure all this out. So what we believe the city's role here is to have an opportunity zone, and we have 4 of them, so we can participate, and then also to try to market and to educate the best we can, or bring in folks that can do that, so that our businesses, property owners, CPAs, investment advisors can give the city's folks the best information, bankers possible. So we also have an enterprise zone meeting. We do that annually. That's going to be in this room on February the 7th at 5:30. So we have tried to identify, which we do every year. We've gone through the list of finalized permits and certificates of occupancy, and if you're in an enterprise zone and close to have spent $100,000, we try to contact you directly to say that you may be eligible to make an application for the enterprise zone. So that's February the 7th at 5:30 in this room. And without further ado, I want to call Adam. And thank you so much for being here, Adam. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Adam Northup. I am from Virginia Community Capital, and I also spend quite a bit of my time with a subsidiary of Virginia Community Capital called Locus Impact Investing. I'm going to guess that most folks in this room are familiar with Virginia Community Capital, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But the short story is we're a nonprofit bank that is focused on getting capital into communities that typically have a more difficult time getting capital, with a particular focus in places like housing and healthcare, food, renewable energy. Locus Impact Investing is a new part of Virginia Community Capital. It's national in scope. It's not just Virginia. And essentially what we're trying to do is get philanthropy to unleash their assets locally. So to actually invest in impact in their local communities, rather than typically what they do with their assets is throw them in the stock market and then grant out whatever they make. So happy to talk to anyone about either of those institutions afterwards, but that gives you a little flavor for where I'm coming from. I've spent, and because of that, I've spent quite a bit of time since June, kind of around the state, talking with groups like this, talking with investors, talking with wealth managers, the state government, et cetera, et cetera. But I've also spent a lot of time nationally. kind of getting a view of the landscape. And so I can talk a bit about that as well. The patterns that you see nationally are similar to what you see in Virginia, which is good, although it also strikes me as we have some opportunity to maybe be a bit more of a leader in this space. So I will try to spend about an hour talking about opportunity zones. Please just make this interactive and ask questions. I have found in these sessions that usually there is quite a range of knowledge from like really have no sort of understanding or context to have even been considering deals. And so I think questions are helpful to anyone. And actually that's where I like to start often is I sort of like to do this high, medium, low thing in terms of how familiar are you with the program? And I will say, so you won't be embarrassed, I rarely get a high, and I usually get a few mediums, and I mostly get lows. So I'll start with, is anyone a high? Has anyone been in this space and even considering a deal or been studying it? Not a surprise. Medium? Low, okay. So, good. Yeah, no, that's, so again, that is not a surprise at all. This is a program, it's a federal tax program that was rolled out with, I'm trying to remember, I think it was 10-page double space was the statute, which is just kind of unheard of. And so there just wasn't a whole lot of rules and guidelines, but that included, it just sort of handed over this program to the country and said, go at it. And so there really isn't a mechanism to learn about it except for attending things like this or studying it yourself or talking to your local economic development groups. So it isn't a surprise. Try to do three things today. One is, since everyone's new to the program, I will spend a good chunk of time introducing you to the program, helping you understand how it works, and the challenges and opportunities that it presents. So we'll have a bit of a structural conversation, and that's where it can get a bit confusing. It's a tax program, and so please stop me and ask questions. I'm not a CPA. I'm not an attorney, but unfortunately I've been in this space for a while now, and I've started to pick up some of the language. And so also just check me on that. I'll try to kind of, my preference is to remain kind of colloquial, but it's tricky with programs like this. The second thing I'll do is I'll spend some time talking about the landscape and kind of what's happening, both nationally and kind of statewide. And then the last thing is I think what we've learned at Virginia Community Capital, and I think the communities and players who really want to make something out of this program have figured out, I think there's a few things that need to come together to really make this program not just a few deals in a particular community of opportunity zones, but maybe a richer chance to revitalize some of these communities. And I'll talk about what some of the elements of that probably are. Anything else that folks want to make sure to get out of this? Okay. So, as I said, federal tax program passed at the end of last year, so it's over a year since it's been enacted. It is what the think tank folks up in DC would describe as a free market approach to economic revitalization and economic development. And what they mean by that is they really don't want to have a lot of rules and regulations around it. They really want it to be market forces that figures this out. And they tried as much as they could to make it simple. Unlike a lot of tax programs in this space in the past, for those of you who are familiar, new markets tax credits, LIHTC, which turned out to be and continue to be kind of just beasts of red tape and bureaucracy and require legions of CPAs and tax accountants. It was a surprise. There were I wouldn't say it got snuck into the tax bill, but not a lot of stakeholders around the country expected it to end up in there, but it did. And so everyone has been on their back feet since then, trying to figure it out. And by everyone, I mean from investor community to business interests, property owners, economic development, state. Everyone's been trying to figure out how to make the most of this, because everyone wasn't really planning towards this being something that was going to be put in place. So it's a tax program with kind of three essential pieces. And I'm going to go into more detail on each of these pieces. But one is the opportunity zone itself. And I'll talk more about that. But that's a physical location. The second thing is an opportunity zone fund, which is an investment vehicle. That's what has the capital. And the third thing is an opportunity zone business or an opportunity zone property, which is inside an opportunity zone, and the opportunity zone fund capitalizes it. So you have three things. By the way, I see people taking notes. Please do, but this will be available as this presentation. Happy to kind of have that for folks, so don't feel like you have to get all the details. So there's these three features. It's the first program like this in quite a while, probably since before the new millennium. And so it is getting a lot of interest from not only the investment community, who benefits from this, which I'll talk more about, but from economic developers, because it really is a potentially very powerful tool. Though I'm going to emphasize this as we go, it's just one tool in the quiver. It isn't the salve to everything. The last thing I'll say, this last point is important, and this might change, and I'll talk more about that. But right now, and this goes in line with sort of the free market thinking, there's no set community impact requirements, meaning that this doesn't have to improve healthcare in the opportunity zones, or create jobs in the opportunity zones, or create housing for the people that actually live in the opportunity zones. And so while this is intended to have quite a bit of good in those zones themselves, there are some potential outcomes which maybe displace the communities that are there. And so there's a lot of concern in the political, government, economic development kind of community stakeholder class here, that the investments are smart in the sense that they really help revitalize those communities, not just kind of take what is there in terms of poverty or other problems and move it somewhere else. So no requirements yet on that front, but I'll talk more about that. So I'm going to go deep on each of these three pieces, so everyone gets to read on that. With one exception, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the opportunity zones themselves. The statute basically told each state, go out and nominate, there's an algorithm, but nominate this number of tracts in your state. The tracts you can only nominate tracts that meet a certain income level. There's some other parameters. And then we at Treasury will take a look at that and approve it nationwide. And by the way, you only have 3 months. I don't know, was it 3 months? It was something crazy. And I think that was very purposeful. It was purposeful because they want the program to go fast, but it was purposeful, I think, also because it prevented a lot of politicking, which can be a good or a bad thing. But basically what Virginia did, like almost every other state, is they said to each of their kind of economic development regions, hey, you rank your opportunity zones, your census tracts that meet these criteria, because you know where there is opportunity for economic development, for improvement in quality of life. You know where there are places where maybe some energy is starting to happen, or maybe you just really want to focus that attention on communities that just don't see anything. But really, it was largely localized. That got rolled back up to the state. The state kind of pulled all that together. They went through and they did a few other kind of overlays, and if there was an they looked at enterprise zones, for example, and said, hey, if an opportunity zone and an enterprise zone are together, that's a really good combination maybe for some development. And so they had and so they were doing a few flags like that to make sure that certain zones were locked in. But they basically nominated 212, sent them up to Treasury, and by June they were approved. This is done. There's no remedy in the statute for changing out an opportunity zone, getting rid of one, adding one. For 10 years, this is what we got. I think in Virginia, most communities I talk to are very pleased with the selection of their opportunity zones. Every once in a while, I run into someone who says, well, you really should have had this one kind of in my region and not this one. But for the most part, I feel like people think they were well selected and sort of meet the basic criteria that we're after, which is a place where an infusion of capital could be particularly helpful. There are some interactive maps. Virginia has one. You guys have one, I think. You guys have a local map online, which is great. There's also some national level ones which do some cool things like overlay a bunch of other programs. Simple Google search, or again, I have even a link in here that you can do. That's what Virginia looks like. It's all over the place. It's both rural and urban. It's more concentrated urban, even though it looks like maybe not. It's just the tractor's smaller. But that is typical also across the country. Questions on the zones themselves? Good, because there isn't really a whole lot you can do about it. Or, you know, they are what they are. There's 4 here, right, is what you said, and we could pull that up when we get to some Q&A as well.
But just don't get lulled into that it's in the, you know, it's an area, because you really do need to look at the address of it.
Yeah.
And we did that on a project not too long ago. I mean, Anna and I were just like across the street, no opportunity zone right there. So like the enterprise zone or any of that, I would just say we're trying to make it so that you can look at it 24 hours a day whenever you need to, but you can also text or, you know, call or whatever it is just to make sure.
Yeah. That's a really common thing that's happening, is sometimes people don't realize it's just across the street, and it is a line, and there's really no way around it. I've even encountered people, this has happened a lot in Southwest Virginia. I've encountered folks who have property that sort of spans census tracts, and so it gets a bit complicated for them. But it doesn't prevent you from kind of sort of doing half of what you want to do with the Opportunity Zone. Okay, so the Opportunity Zone Fund is, so we have the zone itself, and the second kind of structural thing is you have what's called an Opportunity Zone Fund. I want to be careful with the word fund. I know for me it brings up immediately a connotation of big mutual fund, big private equity fund, and what I mean by that is a managed pool of capital, meaning lots of investors that are pooling capital. Someone is managing and administrating that capital, deciding what to invest in, and probably investing in many things. And in opportunity zones, a lot of that will look like that. The funds will look like that. They'll look like these big institutional funds. But a fund could also be me, Adam Northup, sets up an LLC, calls it a fund, and puts my own capital in it. A fund is all you have to do is have a separate legal entity in the form of a corporation or a partnership, and you put a particular kind of money into it, which I'm going to talk about, and it is essentially an Opportunity Zone Fund. So keep that in mind. A fund means anything from your own personal investment vehicle in this space to big, managed institutional funds, and everything in between. And I'll talk more about that, but there's a lot of ways that this could come together. It is in the spirit of kind of the free market simple thing. It's a self-certified fund. And the current proposed form is 2 pages. And so every year, the corporation, the LLC, the large institutional fund will, as part of their federal filing, they will fill out a 2-page form with a bunch of checks to qualify the fund. And it's really not that many checks. They're just some pretty basic things that you need to meet, which I'll continue to share with you. This is just for you to know, but the fund does need to be almost fully deployed into a business and inside an opportunity zone within 180 days. And that's tricky. The good news is they've released some new rules that help with that, and I'll talk more about that. But basically, well, I should have taken a step back. So what kind of capital can sit in these funds? It's very simply capital gains that otherwise would be taxed. And so think about it this way. Any asset that you sell, stock, bonds, artwork, potentially real estate, if it has a capital gain, the government is going to want to tax your capital gain. And so the example I always use is I have $100 in Apple stock. I bought it for $50. If I sell my stock, I have a $50 capital gain that usually gets taxed somewhere between 20 and 25%. Instead of realizing that gain and paying that tax, I can realize that gain and throw it in a fund, and it's going to have a number of tax benefits. So I'm not going to have, the first benefit it has is I'm not going to have to pay that capital gains tax, at least for some period of time. And then this comes back to where I was a minute ago. You have 180 days from when you sell the asset to decide whether or not to put it into one of these funds. So if I sell my Apple stock today, I have until June something, I forget what today is, to decide whether or not to put it in an Opportunity Zone fund. And then that fund has basically 6 months to get it into an Opportunity Zone business or property inside an Opportunity Zone. So essentially, from the time you sell an asset until it's like pretty fully deployed, you have about a year. Otherwise, you'd have to start kind of paying penalties, or there's some other, you may be outside some of the qualifications. So let me talk a bit about the, was there a question?
Is it like a 1031 exchange? Do you have to identify that you got to put it into that fund? Or you plan on putting it into the
Yeah, it's like a 1031 exchange, except the tax benefits are a little different, but it's basically the same thing, which is instead of paying the capital gains tax on it, you're putting it in a new investment.
But do you have to identify, let the IRS know that's your intention?
Yeah.
Like a 1031?
That's the self-certification. Yeah. It's a little less onerous, I think, than a 1031, actually. And the tax benefits are better than a 1031, which I'll talk about here in a minute, potentially. You get 3 tax benefits by putting this capital gain that otherwise would have been taxed into one of these funds. The first is you get a deferral. And you get a deferral for as long as you keep it in that fund, and that fund is deployed in a qualified way, or until December 31st, 2026. So if I sell my Apple stock and put that $50 inside an Opportunity Zone fund and invest in an Opportunity Zone, I'm not paying the capital gains tax on that all the way up until 2026. If I still have that capital inside that fund, on 2026, that's when I have to pay it. Except if I waited, if 2026 is 5 years from the date that I did it, I get a 10% reduction in my tax, and if it's 7 years, I get an additional 5%. So you can get a 15% reduction in the tax if you hold it up till 7 years from when you invest in the fund. The last thing, this is the really big kicker, which is if you have it in an Opportunity Zone fund that's deployed in an Opportunity Zone for 10 years or more, whenever you exit, the capital gain on top of your original capital gain is tax-free. So if I invested $50 in an Opportunity Zone fund, I go 10 years. First, I'm going to get 15% reduction in my tax. But then also, when I sell the asset in 10 years, whatever capital gains on, so if the asset's now worth $100, so I have a $50 gain on top of the gain, that $50 gain is tax-free. And so that's what's different than a 1031 exchange is you just continually avoid taxes with 1031. You can actually eliminate taxes on capital gains with this.
2026, 10 years would be 2016, so I have to get over 10 years. This is 2008.
Sorry, I'm not. Yeah.
You got to hold it for 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the drop dead date is 2026.
Yeah.
You'd have to invest in 2016. Hold it for 10 years.
Actually, the timing is an important point, which I can share with you. It's a good segue to this. The ideal window is between now and the end of this year. Because if you get it in a fund by the end of this year, you can get the 10% reduction, and you can get the additional 5% reduction, which is the full 15. And then anywhere after 2028, so anywhere 10 years or 10 years plus, anytime after 2028 up until like 2046 or something like that, you can exit and be tax-free. So the 2028 is only a marker for purposes of this model. It could be you can exit for many years after that. That's the. But this is a really important point, which is to get the full heft of this, you have to have kind of your money in an opportunity zone fund by the end of this year. That doesn't mean you can't do it here. You just may not get the reduction, and you're going to pay the capital gains sooner. But this 10-year thing starts whenever you put it in the opportunity zone fund. So really, you have until December 30th, 2028 to put it in a fund to at least get the 10-year benefit. Let me go back and make sure I covered all the points here. This is definitely the confusing part about the program is the tax benefit. So let me stop there and let additional questions get asked.
Yeah. So in other words, if I take $1 million, right, I've sold something, I got $1 million.
Yep.
And I take it, I put it, I say, okay, I'm gonna put this in the LLC, and I'm gonna call it a float opportunity fund.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I do that on January 1. Well, I've got until June 30th to go buy a piece of property in an opportunity zone with that money. Is that what you're saying?
Or pay penalties.
Pay penalties.
Yeah.
Okay, so, so once I'm in that property, but I mean, I've got 6 months. Wait a minute, I've got 6 months I can say it's an opportunity fund.
Yeah.
So on June 30th, I've got to go ahead and find a piece of property and close by December 31 the same year.
To avoid penalties.
So avoid penalties.
Yeah.
And then I've got to leave it in there for 10 years to totally defer the gain.
And you're going to have to improve the property, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got to improve the property.
Yeah, substantially.
Okay. So in other words, I've got to buy something maybe for $500,000 and spend $500,000.
You got it. Yeah. In fact, that math is perfect, which I'll get to in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to put that $1 million in within how long of getting it?
From when you sell the asset, so when I sell my piece of artwork or stock or whatever, I got 6 months to put it in a fund. And then when it's in a fund, that fund, before penalties start to hit, has about 6 months until it needs to be deployed.
If you put it in a little later than that, is there a penalty, or you just can't do it?
Oh, no, you can do it. It's just there's a penalty. And the penalty, like when you actually do the math on the penalty, it's not that onerous. Like you could go a few months or a year even, and it isn't the end of the world. But the point, they did do this because they want capital to move quick and they want to avoid speculation, meaning people just go and put money in a fund and buy some property and sit on it, which I'll talk more about. They want people to put money in a fund quickly and get it deployed quickly and get it operating quickly. Not just in real estate, by the way, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's really can be used for almost any business. Yep.
Can you invest in a business?
Yes. Yeah.
So if somebody has a business, you can put your money into their business, it'd be an opportunity fund?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Now you need to structure it appropriately, which I'll talk more about. But yeah, businesses are really good use cases that often get overlooked in this. Especially,
but the business is located in an opportunity.
Yeah, it needs to be essentially operating inside the opportunity. So.
Yeah. But then you take in investors and they would work for that also.
So this is an equity investment. It is. This is not a debt instrument. So anytime you use an opportunity zone fund, you're buying a piece of an asset. Yeah. Yep.
On the initial sale, we're talking about only deferring gain,
yep.
Meaning that you only have to put the gain in, not your total proceeds,
correct.
Like you would in the 10-quarter.
Yeah.
So you can take your whatever basis amount, you can whatever basis is out.
Yep.
So can I create my own investment fund and target a project, or
yeah, so
investing my money in someone else's pool?
You can do either. So as I know a lot of people just locally in Richmond who I know and know that I know something about this, and so I've been kind of guiding them, who are just going to like buy a home that they want to renovate and then rent it for 10 years. That would work. But I also know a lot of people who just want to they know they have capital gains for whatever reason. They've been sitting on stock for a long time and are looking for a place to put a bunch of it and have someone else do all that for them. And so that's why you have this range of what a fund could mean. Yeah. I have the, you'll appreciate this, while it sounds simple to just like, hey, I'm just going to create an opportunity zone fund with my own capital and buy a piece of residential real estate and improve it in 10 years. You know, I have had folks who've gone down that path and then been like, I think it's just easier to put it in a fund. And I'll tell you why that's an important, an important insight in just a moment. So we're starting to actually answer some questions that are in the next realm, which is the third component of this program. So you have, again, the census tract, that's an opportunity zone. You have the fund, which holds this capital that then deploys into an opportunity zone property. So this slide's a little busy, but it's important to know that I leave it this way because it is important to structure your opportunity zone business or transaction in a way that's going to meet the IRS's qualifications, and this is the place where it gets a little bit tricky. But basically, before I get into this, I think there's 4 use cases for this program. One is real estate. So buying property, renovating it, and then operating it for 10 years. Buying land and building something new and operating it for 10 years are really good use cases. And in fact, that's probably, I would bet in 10 years when we look back on this program, that's going to be what at least 75% of what happened in opportunity zones is going to be. But there are 3 good use cases for business, for operating businesses too. One is just start a new business in an opportunity zone. And any equity you apply to it could come from an opportunity zone fund. Another is if you have a business inside an opportunity zone, expand it. And you can use equity to expand it from this capital. Or another one is if you have an operating business that you want to expand anyway, expand it inside an opportunity zone. And that's another way to attract equity. The opportunity zone property, so now I'm going to get into the technicalities of this, needs to be one of 3 things. It needs to be stock, an ownership interest in a partnership, or tangible property itself. And tangible property is real property, but it's also property, plant, and equipment, for example. The stock and partnership is what would probably be the vehicle to invest in an opportunity zone business, which is an operating business. The opportunity zone, an operating business often comes with tangible property, which is why you see that arrow. There's a bunch of kind of sub-qualifications here, which we could spend the rest of the meeting on, number 1. And number 2, they're still being kind of defined by the IRS and Treasury, because this is where almost all the questions are in terms of how this program works. That's sitting up in Washington right now. And I'll give you an update on some of it. But there's a few important things to know. Back to something we just talked about in a minute. If you invest in tangible property, you need to improve that property by at least the cost basis. So if I buy a $50 house, I need to put in another $50. Land isn't going to apply. So if the house is sitting on a $50 lot, the $50 doesn't need to. You don't need to improve it 100. You only need to improve it by the value of the actual tangible property that sits on the land. But that's a big improvement. And so, which is intentional again. It's meant to help revitalize either dormant or distressed buildings. Here's where it gets challenging again from a timeline perspective. You have 30 months to do that.
Is that capital improvements or just improvements in general?
I'm not a tax accountant enough to know the difference. Would
1031, you can use some of the money to fix the profits, but the money has to be for capital improvements only.
Yeah.
Anything you would capitalize. You don't cover carpet, paint,
Yeah. I don't know. I'll have to follow up on that. It's a good question. It's the first time I've been asked that. I think the rules say just the cost basis of the property. So I don't think it's going to be as limiting as that.
So you can't even think
Yeah.
cost basis. That's big cap.
Okay, well then, yeah.
If land doesn't count, what's the cost basis you're driven off of?
The building.
But what if there isn't a building?
Then you don't have, so
Any improvement counts?
I could buy a parking lot and put a shed and that would count.
Okay.
Yeah. At least the way the rules are written out, there's some concern that that's what people do in urban settings. So they're trying to figure out how to do it, but it's a bit of a loophole. Yeah.
Okay.
But the idea is like you should be able to buy a new piece of land and within 30 months improve it somehow with a building, and that would qualify.
Does equipment count at all?
Yes.
It does?
Yeah.
So if you buy a structure and then 10 acres of land, what determines the acquisition cost? Does it need to be spelled out in a contract? If the structure is $10,000?
Yeah.
Or is that an appraisal?
There are the revised rules, which are out, spell this out a little better, and I think there's a few methods you can do it. I think it can be based on, it needs to essentially be market price. That's somehow either an appraisal or if it's new construction, it's the actual cost of the new construction. But it's spelled, I can look up the details for you, but there's multiple ways that you can get there. Yeah. These are good questions. Yeah. The other thing that I will, in terms of an opportunity zone business, we already talked about this. This is being still kind of talked about a lot up in DC with the answers, but theoretically, 50% of the operations, the active conduct of operations need to happen inside the opportunity zone. This is challenging to sort of define when you start thinking about the way technology allows people to work. And so more to come on that, but I think if you are thinking, hey, I'm going to have a location inside an opportunity zone, chances are it'll work. I think their intent is, as long as you have some significant operations there and potentially some jobs there, they want to make it work for that. So more to come on that, but the basic point is, I think as you think about this, think one of those 4 use cases: real estate development, new business, amping up a business that's in there, or installing more operations of your business in there. If it's one of those 4 things, my guess is you can structure it in order to absorb this capital. So I won't spend a lot of time on the numbers here, and again, I'm happy to talk more with folks about this. This is my own model, but I've seen lots of these now, and they all basically come to the same conclusion. Investing in an opportunity zone will probably have, given sort of the way returns generally work, for a business over 10 years, probably 200 to 300, maybe 400 basis point improvement to your bottom line after taxes. So if you do it for a long period of time and it's a good project, that would have probably hurdled on its own. That's sort of the message here. You amplify your return. It is a way to take more risk. So you can take, a potentially riskier project, knowing that on the back end you may have some upside. So this is, by no means like hold me to this, but it's just a common example of how it plays out over time. The only other thing I would say, which is I've talked about, which should be obvious, is the big kicker is the longer you wait. So you get some benefits that grow over time, but then it kind of shoots up. So just keep that in mind. So, wow, I'm spending a lot of time getting this kind of the program to you guys. The last thing in the program is, as I've mentioned a few times, there are proposed rules and regulations that are sitting up at Treasury right now. And in fact, I think they were supposed to meet 2 weeks ago to talk about them, but the government shut down. So it's all a bit on hold. and they finally like filled out like they normally do a bunch of pages with tax rules. It's more like 80 or 90 pages now. But as I said, in general, all they've done is made it very clear to the investment community and businesses and developers that this thing is meant to be flexible, and yes, like it is meant to be as simple as we can make it. So a couple key things I've already talked about, like any capital gain, not just like stock bonds, which everyone kind of was wondering. The self-certification page is two forms. The important point here, which I didn't make before, is you do not need to pre-qualify. This is just self-certification. So unlike a lot of tax programs where you have to go and say, this entity is doing these things and get a check before you can actually do it, you can just kind of go do it, and as long as you're meeting the parameters on the back end. It's until 2047 that you can get the 10-year improvement. This is the big one. There's now a working capital safe harbor of 31 months. So that means you can actually have cash that's not actually deployed yet into new equipment or building materials, whatever it is. As long as you have basically the rules say, as long as you have a plan to deploy that, and you can document that plan for the IRS, we'll give you kind of 30-ish months to hold that cash. So that helps with that first 30-month kind of timeline of deployment. So they've actually created some flexibility there. So I'm going to jump, and that's the program. I'm going to jump to kind of what I'm starting, or what is kind of happening, both nationally and locally. But let me pause there. Any questions on the program itself? We can come back to them as well.
We just talked about, all of this is equity.
Yes.
A lot of the projects will have some debt components.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any restrictions to the financing side?
No. And in fact, there's you can package this together with as many grants, different debt packages. It's just one piece of the capital stack. And so, and I view it as just one. I think this is an important point. It is just one piece of the capital stack. For a lot of these deals, debt is still going to be the biggest tranche. And so keep that in mind. I mean, for businesses, it might be different, but when you're thinking about real estate deals, I still think that's true given sort of the state of interest rates right now. So what's going on right now? This is, I actually just pulled this together with some data that I've known existed for a while, but I hadn't kind of looked at it. But the point is at a national level, there is a lot of money being pooled. This is only what's been announced. I know from conversations that the big banks and their wealth management groups are just creating piles of this stuff. We at VCC have been even approached by them saying, hey, these communities better than us because we're a nonprofit bank that's sort of involved in these communities. We're going to have all these funds. What's kind of the landscape? Some of that's starting to trickle out. You could have seen the news about Wells recently. Prudential, an insurance company, just did a deal in Baltimore. But that stuff's not even included in here. So there are big 500 million plus funds that are going to exist. And quite frankly, I don't think a lot of them know where they're going to put all that capital. Some of them had line of sight to deals in kind of big urban settings that they knew were happening, that have been planning. They probably knew the projects intimately. And so they're actually just finding a way to even kind of amp their returns on those. But there's just a lot of capital that needs to find a home, especially at a national scale. This is a trend that you're starting to see, which is, for a while, it was only national. I'm starting to see regional and state kind of start to tick up. And regional tends to be sort of a multi-state universe. One fund you all might have heard of is, I think it's called the Emergent Communities Fund. It's $250 million. It's a partnership with Rivermont Capital, Beekman, and Enterprise. And their stated intent is to get that capital into Southside, Southwest Virginia, Northwest North Carolina, so kind of this area. And so you're starting to see some of those. I know that fund, they actually have line of sight to some deals, but they don't have line of sight to $250 million. There's also some kind of very state-level funds that are starting to come together, although I haven't seen that publicly announced in Virginia. There are a lot of kind of one-deal opportunity zone transactions happening. And that's what you see very little of because it's typically a private deal. But I've seen some of those PPMs. There are happening in Richmond for sure. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, the ability to do that once some of those transactions happens gets a lot less expensive for us. So I'm glad that that's happening because it's the lawyers and accountants need to work out some of the kinks in those early deals. But not a lot of those have been publicly announced in Virginia yet. You are starting to see, so lots of capital, and probably not as many shovel-ready projects that need to exist for that capital. And so you're starting to see this recognition, especially at a state level, that some other things need to come together. I encourage any of you to look at these examples. And I expect, actually, fairly soon that we'll be able to put Virginia on this in kind of a leading space in terms of a marketplace that I think that they're envisioning putting together. But the point is while I started the session saying this law was intended not to have a lot of like intermediaries, the reality is it needs some intermediaries to make some things happen. And I think you all are going to feel Virginia start to get into the mix here in a helpful way soon, too. I didn't even have it up here because it's relatively new. I didn't have a chance to create the slide. But a number of states are adding incentives, too. Maryland just announced a $60 million package sort of aimed at opportunity zones to go along with this. And it ranges from kind of taking grants they otherwise would have had and kind of forcing them into opportunity zones or new incentives for jobs, those kinds of things. It's a whole range of things. The more states that do that, the more pressure there's going to be on other states to do that. I will say, I talked to the state here a lot. I don't think they have any plans yet to add any incentives, but there's nothing like peer pressure. And it's starting to build. You're seeing it I think, in Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana. It's starting to trickle out that the states feel like they need to kind of add some incentives to the mix as well. Here are the challenges, I think, to why this thing isn't this market program isn't fully off and running. One is what I already said, which is there is kind of plenty of capital, but there's only so many kind of large urban real estate projects for that to flow to. And that's where that investor, that's sort of their mindset of that's their first place that they think. At a sort of more micropolitan, especially rural level, but even in the kind of the urban communities themselves, there is, it's just taking time for awareness to set in, to understand the program, to understand how it might help the businesses that are already there or the communities that are there. And so right now, again, mostly what you're seeing is kind of multi-use projects or large residential projects inside of probably already somewhat revitalizing urban areas. And then the last piece is, which is important, even if you had a lot of capital and you had a lot of projects, there isn't a good mechanism right now to connect those things. And it's back to the call that I just met. I'll give you another example of a call that I got was from Stanford MBA students who were starting a fund and wanted to know where to deploy their money in Virginia. And so capital doesn't know where to deploy, and even if I could have pointed them to 2 or 3 projects, this was months ago, there just is they don't know anyone. They don't have any relationships. They don't know what's going on the ground. They don't, And so this is kind of this efficient market doesn't even really exist, and that's a big challenge. So our thesis is this. This just gets into why I'm super excited to be in rooms like this, which is I think there's going to be plenty of, whatever they just announced in Baltimore, $60 million deals. There's going to be, unless we get active and start figuring out, and by we, I mean the financial institution community, the investment community, wealth management community, developers, business owners, community leaders, economic development, unless some of that starts to come together in these opportunity zones, that lack of market means there's just going to be this severe imbalance of where the capital is flowing. I think that imbalance is going to, 10 years from now, it's still going to look like that. I think that with the right intervention, we can tip it, we can get a few more dollars on the other side into a lot of communities in need. Which just gets to kind of the punchline in terms of what needs to exist, I think, to get the most out of this program. And this is what you're starting to see in pieces around the country. You're seeing some of these things happening. I can tell you again, Virginia is staring at this same sort of view and saying we want to do all of it. So it's good news. But really kind of our belief is you need sort of four things. One is you got to have a place to connect people. And that can be just a simple online exchange. It can be regional forums that are bringing together the investment community and the business community. Someone literally needs to have the spreadsheet of all the projects in an opportunity zone. It seems so simple, but it isn't, right? And who should own that and who should do it? But it needs to start to build, and it can be multiple spreadsheets, but there needs to be a place for an investor to be like, okay, well, what are the things going on? The other thing is so even if you have a place to bring people together and a bunch of investable projects, you still need to kind of market yourselves. It is a competitive space. As I've said, a bunch of states are getting on it. Cities and regions are sort of like going out and saying, hey, our city's the best. Come here. And so there is going to be a bit of competition once you really have some projects to get after that capital. And then the last thing is, I think this is an important thing, is to really understand over time kind of what's happening, what's really happening, so that we can adjust the program. If it's only big urban real estate deals, I think 10 years is going to pass and the program will die. But if it's doing other things, I think it potentially becomes a long-term tax program that we can benefit from. So if we learn how to use it, it could continue over time instead of learning how to use it once and it gets discarded. So I took about an hour. I'm just going to pause there and just kind of open it up to any questions. Again, I will send this out afterwards, but what else can I tell you?
Is the program compatible and can be used with other tax credit programs like the storage and new markets?
It is. It gets a little, so you absolutely can from a sort of a regulatory legal standpoint. But sometimes the incentives and the sort of the way that the programs work don't match up. So for example, in a lot of like LIHTC deals or new market tax credit deals, that tax credit is the equity. And so they don't need more equity. And so having another source of equity isn't really helpful. And so sometimes they just don't really match up all that well. But if you needed more equity in your deal and you can stack these things. State, local, and federal. Yeah.
Tax credit programs, usually the legal and accounting fees are pretty steep.
Yep.
So is there a threshold? If you're just using the single program, is there a threshold of what dollar size makes sense?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think the good news is the transaction cost should be far less than like new market tax credit and LIHTC. And that's intentional. There is the legal and tax community. Any of you guys are lawyers or accountants. I think you would say this too. Like they would love to get in here and be doing a lot of advisor advisory and fees. And I do think there's a huge place for them to play, but not in the same, like, I mean, you can't even get a new market tax credit deal done without like a huge transaction cost associated with that. So the good news is I don't think you have that huge transaction cost. What is the like, how big does a deal need to be so that you can, afford it? A $10,000 deal obviously wouldn't work if it was just your own thing, and unless you just didn't care about your own time. But I don't know. I don't know what the level is. I haven't done the math there. But I think much smaller than some of those deals. Yep.
If you invest in Opportunity Zone Fund, does the fund turn around and lend money, or do they have to have ownership in the project?
Ownership.
So they have to be like a limited partner.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's only equity vehicle. They can't lend. Yeah. Yep.
So when you create your LLC and you put money in it, have you immediately just certified yourself that is for this fund?
Well, you certify it on your tax return, whenever that is, relative to that, yeah.
And is there a spreadsheet that shows the penalty if you go over that 90 days putting it into this fund?
I mean, you can construct it really quick, but this is the...
I saw something earlier.
Yeah, it's on the bottom of here.
Those dates of June 30 and December 31, they're not any cutoff as to when your 180 days starts. I mean, it won't make any difference if you sold something in December of last year. You still have 180 days from then. It's one of these things like based on when your closest tax due date, maybe the 15th or anything like that, right?
This, in the parentheses here, I think the new rules are going to make it dynamic like that. The original law was written as like, these are the 2 dates that you're going to take that data point. But I'm pretty sure I'll have to double check that the new regulations say, hey, you have 6 months from when you actually put the funds in. And it isn't.
I mean, from when you sold the asset, to put the 180 days from when you sold the asset, to put it into the fund.
Right, but then you have a test, which is 6 months after that. The first test of how much is deployed is, and then you have another 6 months, and they take the average of that.
Are there any restrictions to be the equity investor in the developer?
Just structurally, you need to have two probably different entities.
But you can be both.
Yeah. The only self-dealing you can't do, actually, this is a good, is you can't sell your asset to yourself. So you can't, like, if you already own a building in an opportunity zone, you can't sell it to yourself in order to start this program.
Facilitate an opportunity zone?
Yeah.
I actually was thinking that same thing.
Yeah.
I thought you said this was self-certified.
Yeah. Actually, you can do it up to 20%. You can sell 20% of it to yourself. But
if you own a property in an opportunity zone and you're willing to invest in it, but you haven't classified it under this program, so can you participate or not?
Well, if you already own the property, it's difficult, right? Because what are you going to put the equity into?
If you make it
yeah, but the improvements have to be on an asset that you purchase after. Yeah. Now you could set up an operating business and buy equipment.
We're only a block away.
But you can improve it, and that money can go towards it, right?
I don't think so.
Can you set up a construction
It's only
business
after
to renovate the building?
Now, there's an idea, right? You could set up a construction business that only does
Just
renovate stuff inside an opportunity zone for roughly 10 years. That would work. That'd be that'd be a business. Yeah.
Can you explain to me this penalty? So if I put $1 million in and wait a year, what would that penalty be?
How does that math work?
You put $1 million in and you haven't deployed any of it.
Well,
Is that what?
Haven't created a fund to put money in.
Oh, well, then you would get taxed. You would have to pay the tax on your tax return. Yeah. This is you pay the penalty once the money's in a fund and the fund is not deployed into a business or property.
On $1 million, it should be 40,000.
Yeah.
And if 180 goes in, you wait 12 months. Say, you have You have a per month, let's say you have, I guess it would only be a 6-month penalty, so
Yeah.
it's 20,000. You can have 6 months to,
Yeah.
you should have defaulted, you have 6 months at 4%, it'd be 20,000.
But if the fund isn't created yet,
Then
because
it's-
we're
then-
waiting for this information and, the capital gain,
Yeah,
and realize
it's
in
just gonna fall back
February,
here.
then you're outside
Yeah.
180, so you're,
Yeah.
That's the big penalty.
yeah, that's right.
What percentage of the business does the fund have to own?
It can be 1%. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean,
But you said the fund has to own, the owner of that.
I mean, if you have a giant business and you just want, a little bit of equity for a new operations, like, yeah, I mean, it could still be a small part of the overall equity. Yeah. Yep.
Does that, those rules, that 6 month and 1 year, supersede the normal, like, 1031 rules?
You basically have to choose between a 1031 and this. That is, like, you can't do both. And so, yeah, one or the other.
So if you close on a big deal, you could add, you're saying you could do the 6 month thing or whatever?
Yeah, you could. And I don't know what is it 6 months for a 1031 that you have? Is that what it is?
45 days, I think, to identify it. 6 months.
Yeah, so you sort of have a 6 month horizon in either case to decide whether or not to do a 1031 or a, yeah, that's what you meant, yeah. All right, well, listen, I'm going to stick around for a bit, and we'll be happy to answer any other questions. We'll be glad to send this out, and even after the meeting, I'll pass out cards. Feel free to reach out to me or anyone at Virginia Community Capital. Ernie and Cindy as well, who I should have introduced, are here. I apologize.
Virginia Community Cap, we all did it.
Yeah.
And Kelly Johnson is here from Senator Warner's office, and I just want to say thank you so much to Anna Benson and Jason for setting this all up with your staff in my office. And thank you, Adam. That was.
You're welcome.
How will we get this? So you're going to put it out? How will we get it?
We'll email it.
We'll send it to everybody.
Thank you all.